So today's video is going to focus on natural selection and how that can impact evolution. And this should be mostly review. If you remember from your freshman year, there's a lot of vocabulary in the evolution unit. So make sure that you're paying attention if there's words you don't know or that you need described a little bit better or a little bit further in class. Make sure you mark those words in your notes so that we can be sure that those are things that are talked about and cleared up while we're in class together. So speaking of vocabulary, we're going to start with a little bit. So evolution in general is just going to be a change. And it says here that it's a change in our inherited characteristics. Well, remember, our inherited characteristics come from our DNA. So evolution is going to be a change in the DNA. And it's going to occur to the population as a whole, okay, over many, many, many generations. So you notice this isn't immediate. Evolution doesn't occur in your lifetime. You don't, or let's not use you as an example because humans get a little weird since we think and are a little bit more cognitive than other organisms. Let's say we have a tree growing in the backyard. That tree does not evolve in its lifetime. Now that population of trees over time could change and shift, but that one tree doesn't evolve over its lifetime. We have two basic types of evolution, micro versus macro evolution. So microevolution is going to refer to evolution on the small scale, so with the actual genes. So microevolution is going to be a change in the gene frequency. So how often I'm seeing this gene within a population over time. So this is focused on that actual DNA change. That looks like that says in a gene poop. In a population. So I have this gene change that can occur within a population over time, and that's my microevolution. My macroevolution would be the large-scale changes in the gene frequency in a population over time. So this isn't one little allele changing over time. These are these big, large chunks of DNA, these large-scale changes that are happening in the gene frequencies over time. Both of them, though, are in the gene frequency, and then as their name implies, small scale versus large scale. So natural selection, remember, acts on individuals, so it's a mechanism of evolution. And what it is that differential survival. We called it a lot of times the survival of the fittest. Right? That differential survival, meaning that some organisms are better suited to survive and others are not. Evolution, what's key for evolution to occur is that there has to be differential reproductive success. What we mean by that is that certain organisms are better suited to survive, pass on their DNA, okay? and they pass on their DNA by producing offspring. So we have some organisms that are easily able to produce lots of offspring. Other organisms in the population maybe don't produce any. Maybe they don't live long enough to produce any. So natural selection is that mechanism of the differential survival and the different reproductive success, which over time can lead to evolution. It is not, though, evolution. We can see, like if you look at the picture over here, you have two mice. Okay? And these two mice are going to have differential survival. And if they lived in the same environment, they would 100% have differential survival. If they lived in this environment of the sand area, this mouse here would probably survive, while this mouse would be more likely to be seen by predators. So the light-colored mouse would have a different rate of survival, a different reproductive success due to natural selection. Okay? It's acting on the individual, but over time, the light-colored mice are the ones that are producing, so you start to see more and more light-colored mice in the population. Same with if they lived in the rock environment here, that dark environment. This little mouse squirrel thing would survive, where the light-colored one would not. So again, I'd have a differential reproductive success. So natural selection would act on this rodent population. And now, over time, I would see the rodent population start to be darker in color because that was better for them. And that would be the actual evolution. So let's look at some things that are needed for natural selection to be able to occur. Okay, so I have to have variation within the population, meaning there has to be natural, there's different colors, there's different, if we're looking at these finches here, okay, you'll notice these finches have different beak shapes. Their eye placement could be different. Their body size could be different. Again, body color is going to be different. There has to be variation in the population. If everything was exactly the same, then nobody would have a differential reproductive success. Nobody would be better suited to the environment than somebody else. So we have to have variation built into the population already. We have to make more offspring than are going to survive. Okay? We're going to make more offspring are going to be produced than the environment can actually support. And what that will do is that forces competition to happen. If there's no competition, then again, there's no natural selection. If there's no reason for somebody to be better than the other, if everybody has the exact same access and there's no limiting factors, then there is not going to be any natural selection. So I produce more offspring and I force competition. Competition for food, for a mate, for a nesting site in the case of these birds, to be able to escape predators. And the ones that are better suited to that environment, they can escape the predator better. They can find a mate better. They can source food better. Those are the ones that are going to have babies. They're going to pass on their DNA, so their children will be similar to them. So that competition leads us to that differential survival. Again, those ones that have those more successful traits, which are called adaptations, those are the ones that are going to reproduce. And when they reproduce, they pass their DNA on. And so as their DNA is being passed on, it's staying in the population. And so the population, again, over time will start to shift. That's why, so if we look at this example here with finches, with Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands, these finches actually usually live on different islands for different environments. Okay? Where this population of finches are better at eating large nuts and seeds, they can crack them open. These live in drier places where they have to reach down into small cracks to get their food, or the vegetation has more spines, more like a cactus, and so they can go in between the spines. But this, for instance, this bird right here with this big giant beak wouldn't be well suited to the same environment as the little yellow bird over there in the bottom right. So there was variety within the population, and then the ones that were better suited to their particular environment are the ones that were reproducing. And the graph is showing us the length of the female water strider and the amount of eggs laid over their lifetime. And you can see how you can, if you follow your lines here, like for instance, let's look in the middle, at the middle graph here. I have the length of the female water strider, and there's kind of an optimum amount of eggs that they lay for them to be successful. And then it becomes, when they become too long, as they get longer, it's better for them to lay less eggs. Right? If you look over here on the far right, if I look at this one, shows me my lifespan of adult females in days. So I've got the length of the water strider, and as they get longer, their lifespan is going down a little bit. And the one on the right is showing me how many eggs they're laying per day. Okay, and so the longer the female is, the more eggs they're laying per day, which makes sense that the more eggs they would lay over their lifetime. Okay, but their lifetime goes down. Their length of life is longer. So they're all going to end up laying hopefully about the same amount of eggs. Okay. So about the same amount of eggs. However, you're going to have kind of a peak between lifetime, eggs laid, and length of the female water strider. And I would say this would be right here at about 14 millimeters. Okay? They're laying the most eggs over their lifetime, so they're passing on the most DNA. Their lifespan is a little shorter than if they were not quite as long, but only by a few days. So reproductively, they are producing the most eggs, therefore they're leaving the most DNA. And so you're going to start to see over time more and more of the water strider, female water strider population will be around closer to that 14 millimeter mark. Environmental pressures play a huge role in natural selection, right? The environment is going to be a little bit different from place to place to place. So in some places it may favor one particular phenotypic variation, in others it may favor a different one. So environmental pressures are going to have an impact on natural selection's ability to function. Okay? And we're going to look at 3 different types of selection that can occur in environments. So the first one we're going to look at is directional selection. And we're going to look at this using these rock pocket mice here. Okay, so here's my original population in this first graph here on the left. And the original population is following a nice normal curve. Most of the mice are this kind of medium brownish color, with a few being really dark colored and a few being really light colored. So they're spanning the range. Okay? When we have directional selection occurring, that is what's occurring in this top graph here. So with directional selection, conditions have changed in the environment, or they're in an environment where conditions will start to favor one extreme of the phenotypic range or the other. So for example, in this case, my original population was in the middle, right? But now my new population has shifted in one direction, in particular to the right, to the darker end of the spectrum. That could have come from, for example, those peppered moths when pollution came in. We'll look at that in the next slide. These mice could have needed to move to a different environment, and maybe that environment has more of those dark colored rocks. Okay, and so they are able to hide better in this new environment. It could have gone the other direction. It doesn't always have to go to the right. Okay, it can go either direction, and that would look the same. It just would have come over here. But so in directional selection, I am favoring one extreme of the phenotypic range. I'm favoring either, in this case, either the dark end or the light end. Okay, I can also have what's called disruptive selection. So disruptive selection is what's happening here in this second graph here. It's sometimes called diversifying selection. So in disruptive or diversifying selection, I'm favoring both ends of the phenotype, but not the middle. So the intermediates in the middle are not a good color to be in this example. So in this example here, I'm favoring the really light colored mice and the really dark colored mice, but those kind of medium brown colored mice, they're kind of stuck in nowhere land. They're too light for the dark rocks and they're too dark for the light sand. So this is called disruptive because it disrupts down the middle. You end up with these 2 curves now. You end up with these 2 peaks instead of the one. So I've disrupted, okay, or I've diversified because I'm favoring 2 phenotypes now, not just one phenotype. So I'm diversifying. Those 2 are the same kinds of selection. And the third kind of selection here would be stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection is what's occurring in this last graph over here. Okay, and so stabilizing selection is going to favor that intermediate one. Now I'm favoring that medium brown one, but I'm favoring it a lot. So what happens to my curve is my curve gets skinnier, right? It got skinnier and it got taller. And so what that does is it decreases the width of my curve, got a lot smaller. So my variability went down. So with stabilizing selection, the variation within the population goes down. And a lot of times that's not ideal. Okay? So it keeps the middle phenotype, the most popular. Okay? And it reduces those extreme phenotypes. So 3 types of selection. We will work with an activity that will manipulate these. That will you'll do some calculations, you'll push the curves side to side, okay, and we'll work with these curves in class. So let's look at our peppered moth example. This is a really common example. Okay, and we're going to, what kind of selection would have caused this? So the peppered moths in the early 1800s, so pre-industrial England, you can see here, 1848-ish, right? Early 1800s, pre-industrial England, very little population. So the trees looked a lot more like this. Light-colored trees had a lot of lichen growing on the trees. So a light-colored moth, like this guy or this guy, blended in nicely to that lichen. And so the percentage of light-colored moths was really high. And the dark-colored moths were really low because they would stick out and the birds could eat the moths. They'd see them and eat them. In the late 1800s, when England went through the Industrial Revolution, they produced a lot of pollution. And the pollution made the trees turn this dark color here. And so when the trees turned that dark color there, the dark colored moths were the ones that were surviving and they were producing babies. And the light colored moths were the ones that were getting eaten, so they weren't producing babies. So I have differential reproductive success happening here. And now I went from, if the light colored is going to be the green, right? Originally I was way down here on my phenotypic spectrum, but now I'm way over here. So I had a directional selection. I shifted my original population towards the dark color. In the mid-1900s, so now you can see our third step on our graph here. Mid-1900s, there was a lot of environmental laws and pollution controls happening. And so the clean air laws and, cleaning up the factories here. So now the trees have gone back to this light color. And so now it's not great to be a dark colored moth anymore. And so you see the dark colored moth population has gone down where the light colored has gone up. So now it has directionally shifted back the other direction. So we're seeing directional selection happening in this population. The Industrial Revolution was kind of the catalyst for this, but really it comes down to the change in the environment. There was a change in the environment. There had to be variation to begin with. You'll notice there was dark moths in 1895 and there were light moths. And as the dark moths started to survive more and reproduce, we saw the shift, we saw the evolution happen to the whole population. The whole population became more commonly to be dark. And then when they cleaned it up, the shift went back towards it being more common for them to be light colored because were having differential reproductive success. Sometimes our natural phenotypic variation, right? Again, remember we said to have natural selection happen, we have to have variation in the population. So sometimes that natural phenotypic variation can increase or decrease the fitness of the organism in the particular environments, like we just saw, right? We saw it was better at one point to be a dark colored. My natural color was better to be dark, and at one point it was better for my natural color to be light. Okay, one of the common examples that we see with this is insecticide and drug resistance or antibiotic resistance. So what happens with this is we have our natural variation in the population. If you look at this picture over here on the right with these bugs, and we spray the insecticide, and this bug right here naturally has a gene that allows it to be resistant to that insecticide. So that bug lives. And then that bug has bug babies. Well, those bug babies have its same DNA. So those bug babies are now resistant to the insecticide as well. So now when I spray that bug spray on these bugs, it doesn't do anything. The bugs don't die. So now I have to go find something else that will get rid of the bugs. So my resistant survivors reproduce, so that resistance is inherited. So more and more of the population becomes resistant. Okay, this happens with antibiotic-resistant drugs. MRSA, okay, are antibiotic-resistant infections. The bacteria were naturally resistant to the antibiotic. This is what we talked about when we looked at the bacterial transformation video, that some of them may have been naturally resistant to that ampicillin. Some of those bacteria are naturally resistant to the antibiotic. Those bacteria survive and they reproduce. Well, they're resistant to the antibiotic, so now we have to find something else that can hopefully kill them before the infection gets out of control. Okay, the picture down below shows you how the insect could be resistant, right? There's resistant target sites. The insecticide is able to only get in through there's and so over the insecticides only be able to get through one. All the rest of these are resistant. So over time, I see a decreased number of target sites. So they become more and more and more resistant to this. Okay, so we'll work with these things in class. None of these concepts I don't think are overly difficult, and I think most of you get these concepts. So where our focus is going to be on analyzing data for it and writing about it, making sure that we can clearly explain what's happening in these concepts.